In this lesson, we're going to focus on the cell membrane, which is surrounding the outside of the cell and sort of controlling what's going in and out. We talked already about some of the parts inside. We're going to focus just on the membrane in this lesson. As I said before, the cell membrane forms a barrier or kind of guards the exterior of the cell, and it actually controls what's going in and out of the cell. We say that the cell membrane is selectively permeable, which means that it selects what can come in and go out. I'd like to say the cell membrane is similar to a window screen. The window screen allows the air, the fresh air, to come in, but it does not allow the bugs and the leaves to come in, and so it somehow controls what's coming in and out. We can still have the breezes and not have the bugs. The cell membrane's like that. The cell membrane controls what goes in and out. Some things are allowed to come in, some things are blocked. Now, the structure of cell membranes is made up of these molecules called phospholipids. These are lipids. We talked about lipids earlier in the year and how they're a chain of carbon and hydrogen. These are called phospholipids because they have one end that is not a lipid. One end is a phosphate group. The other end is a lipid. What that means is that the phosphate part, can dissolve in water, and the lipid part cannot, and this gives membranes their special properties. This forms the barrier. Actually, the lipid forms the barrier. So a phospholipid looks something like this. It has this circular part at the top, which is the phosphate, and then it has these two lipid legs coming down. And the membrane itself is made up of thousands and thousands of those. The center area here is made up of lipid, and then the top and bottom is made of the phosphate. Also, we find in the cell membrane some large proteins stuck in there. Some of these proteins transport substances so they can form a passageway so that substances can come through or go out, go in. Some of them allow the cells to communicate with one another, such as these proteins sticking out here and here. They're like little cell name tags, these ones too, sticking out, like little cell name tags, and so that cells can talk to each other and they know who they are. And believe it or not, cells really do that. They talk to each other and communicate with each other. Now, what substances can pass through easily through this lipid membrane? These are small molecules. They can pass through without any help. They just pass right through. Substances such as oxygen, carbon dioxide, and water pass right through this membrane. We call this passive transport. No energy is required. These substances regularly just pass in and out. Now, the movement of substances that way is called diffusion. Diffusion. You may have heard of this before. Because molecules are always moving, they will spread out. If you drop some dye in water, over time the dye spreads out and goes in every single area of the water. It spreads out into all of that whole container of water. It does that because the molecules are simply moving around, and eventually they make their way to the whole container of water. This process is called diffusion. Now, there's a special kind of diffusion I want you to know about, and this is called osmosis. Osmosis is diffusion of water. So because water is small, it moves across the membrane no problem, and no energy is required. And so when water moves across the membrane into or out of the cell, we call that osmosis. Now, there's a couple of terms I want you to understand with osmosis. The first is hypotonic. Hypotonic refers to a solution or a mixture of substances that has a lot of water but not very many solids. So this is a highly concentrated type of solution. If a cell is placed into a hypotonic solution, it means it's dilute, okay? It's not got very many solids. Water will move into the cell. Water will move in because there's more solids outside than in, so water will just move in. Oftentimes, cells will swell up and might even break apart because of a hypotonic solution. The opposite kind of solution is called hypertonic. Hypertonic solutions are mixtures with a lot of solids and less water. And again, water can move in and out. So what will happen if a cell is placed in this hypertonic solution, water will move out. By osmosis, water will move out of the cell, and the cell will shrivel up and dehydrate. It might look something like this. Now, plant cells respond differently because of the cell wall in a hypertonic solution. Actually, let's start with a hypotonic solution. Water will enter, but at some point the cell wall will prevent any more water from coming in, and they will not burst. In a hypertonic solution, water will leave and the cytoplasm will shrink up, but the cell wall will maintain the shape of the cell. Now, what we've talked about so far, osmosis is a passive process, and it happens automatically without the help of anything. Those molecules can simply move through. For some molecules, there's a little channel, a little pathway for the molecules to move because they cannot move through without it. They cannot move through the membrane unless there's a little channel for them to move through. These are called protein carrier molecules, and this will help a substance to move, still not using any energy but having a special pathway. An example is glucose. Glucose is too large to move through the membrane by itself, and it has to go through this little protein channel. Last but not least, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about something called active transport. So far, we've only talked about passive transport, such as osmosis, but in some cases, energy is required to move substances, and this is because substances are moving against diffusion. Okay, diffusion wants them to move a particular way, and the cell wants them to move the other way. In this case, the cell must use energy, and there are three ways this can happen. Sometimes there's a protein in the molecule, in the membrane, kind of like the passive transport carrier molecules. In this case, though, energy is required for the substance to move through that carrier protein. In other cases, there might be little vesicles that are created as substances enter and leave the cell. If substances are entering the cell, it is called endocytosis, movement into the cell through a vesicle. It looks something like this. So the substances come in, the membrane pinches off and forms a little vesicle. If substances are moving out of the cell, we call that exocytosis. And again, using a vesicle, you have a little vesicle with substances. Maybe this is some kind of waste product the cell wants to get rid of. It's going to go to the membrane, and it will open up and fuse with the membrane and push out these molecules it wants to get rid of. All three of these, 1, 2, and 3, require energy to happen. Passive transport does not require energy. Active transport does.